Schrödinger's cat paradox. In 1935, the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger proposed a thought experiment to illustrate one of the most puzzling ideas in quantum mechanics: quantum superposition and measurement. Imagine a closed box, completely isolated from the outside. Inside that box, there is a cat, a vial with poisonous gas, a Geiger counter, and a small radioactive particle. The particle has a 50% probability of decaying within 1 hour and a 50% probability of remaining intact. If the radioactive particle decays, the Geiger counter detects it and breaks the vial, releasing the poison and killing the cat. But if the particle does not decay, the vial remains intact and the cat stays alive. Up to this point, everything seems simple, based on probability. However, what is truly strange happens when we try to describe the state of the cat before opening the box. According to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, before observing the system, it exists in a state of superposition. The radioactive particle is decayed and not decayed at the same time. Therefore, the cat is simultaneously alive and dead, a combination that is impossible from our everyday experience. Only when the box is opened and the system is observed does the superposition collapse into a single outcome. Either the cat is dead or it is alive. This paradox was designed to highlight the absurdity of applying the quantum interpretation to macroscopic objects, such as a cat. In the quantum world, particles can exist in multiple states at once. But how can this be applied to the real and observable world? Schrödinger, in fact, did not intend to defend the paradox, but rather to point out the philosophical and conceptual problems that arose when extending quantum rules to larger scales. The debate over the meaning of this paradox has not ended. Some physicists consider that the paradox highlights the incompleteness of the Copenhagen interpretation. Others, such as Hugh Everett, propose the many worlds interpretation, in which, upon opening the box, the universe splits into two, one where the cat is alive and another where it is dead, with both realities existing in parallel. This paradox is not just a philosophical game. It has profound implications in modern quantum theory, such as quantum coherence and decoherence. In fact, phenomena such as quantum entanglement and quantum computing depend on similar principles of state superposition. So what does Schrödinger's cat paradox tell us beyond quantum strangeness? It forces us to reflect on the relationship between the observer and reality. Does reality exist objectively, or is it only defined when we interact with it? This question, which seems taken from the deepest philosophy, remains one of the greatest unresolved mysteries of modern physics. The Barber paradox, formulated by the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, is a logical paradox that challenges conventional understanding of self-reference and definition. Imagine a small town where there is a strict and universal rule. The barber shaves all the men who do not shave themselves, and only those men. Up to this point, it seems like a simple statement, but a problem arises when a fundamental question is asked: who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then according to the rule he should not do so, since he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. However, if he does not shave himself, then, according to the same rule, he should shave himself, since he shaves all men who do not do so. Thus, the barber is trapped in a contradiction. He can neither shave himself nor refrain from shaving without violating the rule. This paradox illustrates a deep problem in logic and set theory, especially when it comes to self-referential definitions. Russell formulated this paradox in an attempt to expose a contradiction in the foundations of the set theory of his time, particularly in the work of Gottlob Frege. The paradox arose when trying to define the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Can a set contain itself without falling into contradiction? To understand it better, imagine a catalog that lists all catalogs that do not mention themselves. If this catalog mentions itself, it contradicts its own definition. If it does not, it should be listed within its own contents. This logical tension reveals a problem with systems that allow unrestricted self-referential definitions. Russell proposed a solution to this dilemma through type theory, a hierarchy of sets in which a set can only contain elements from a lower level and never itself. In this way, problematic self-reference is avoided by restricting how sets can be defined. However, the Barber paradox is not only a mathematical issue. Its application extends to the philosophy of language, the theory of knowledge, and even literature. For example, the paradox can be seen reflected in stories where characters are trapped in impossible logical loops, or in situations where rules contradict themselves. Imagine a society with a strict law. All citizens must obey the laws except those who do not. A judge faces a criminal who has disobeyed the law. Should the judge punish him or not? If the judge punishes him, the judge would be enforcing the law, which contradicts the nature of the crime of the accused. If the judge does not punish him, the judge would be allowing the law to be disobeyed. The Barber paradox, like other paradoxes, invites us to reflect on the limits of language and logic. Can language fully describe reality without falling into contradictions? Or are there inherent limits in our ability to construct absolute systems? This paradox is a reminder that rules, no matter how simple they may seem, can hide deep contradictions when applied without question. It challenges us to think critically about how we define things and how the rules and logical systems we create can collapse under their own weight. Ultimately, the Barber paradox does not have a simple solution. It teaches something fundamental. Even in what appears clear and obvious, there can be complexities and contradictions that challenge our most basic understanding of the world. Perhaps the true lesson is not to resolve the paradox, but to accept the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of human thought. The liar paradox is a logical and philosophical enigma that arises from self-reference and the inherent contradiction in certain statements. Its most classic form is the declaration, "This sentence is false." The problem lies in determining whether the statement is true or false. If it is true, then what it asserts must be correct. That is, the sentence is false, which contradicts its original truth. If it is false, then what it declares is not correct. That is, it is not false, which implies that it is true. Thus, an infinite cycle is generated with no clear solution. This paradox has ancient roots and dates back to the Greek philosopher Epimenides, who stated, "All Cretans are liars." Since Epimenides was a Cretan, if he was telling the truth, then his statement had to be false, which implies that not all Cretans are liars, including his own statement. If he was lying, then some Cretan had to be telling the truth. But this refutes his own declaration. A liar paradox reveals deep problems in formal logic and the theory of truth. In classical logic, a proposition cannot be simultaneously true and false. However, this paradox challenges that fundamental principle by presenting a statement that seems to fulfill both conditions at once. Philosophers and mathematicians, such as Alfred Tarski, have attempted to resolve this paradox by proposing hierarchical theories of truth. Tarski argued that a statement can only be evaluated at a metalogical level above the language in which it is formulated. That is, the statement "this sentence is false" cannot be evaluated within the same language in which it is expressed. Another attempt to address this paradox comes from the theory of formal systems developed by Kurt Gödel, who demonstrated with his incompleteness theorem that sufficiently complex logical systems are incapable of proving all the arithmetic truths they contain. This implies that in any formal system powerful enough, there will exist true statements that cannot be proven as such. In contemporary philosophy, the liar paradox has also been explored in relation to semantics and self-reference. Paul Grice, for example, analyzed how context and the speaker's intention can influence the interpretation of these paradoxical statements. In literature, the liar paradox has been used to explore themes of truth and deception. A notable example is the story The Liar by Isaac Asimov, where a robot programmed not to lie faces insurmountable contradictions when attempting to tell the truth in all circumstances. Even in everyday life, the liar paradox appears in self-referential statements such as "I always lie." This statement poses a similar problem. If it is true, it implies that the person lies, which would make it false. And if it is false, then the person is telling the truth, contradicting the statement itself. Ultimately, the liar paradox not only highlights the limitations of formal logical systems, but also invites reflection on the very nature of truth, language, and the limits of our understanding. By challenging our basic notions of truth and falsity, this paradox continues to be a central topic in logic, philosophy, and linguistics, reminding us that even the simplest statements can hide deep and unexpected complexities. The paradox of the ship of Theseus is a classic philosophical dilemma that explores identity and continuity over time. The story dates back to ancient Greece and poses a fundamental question. If a ship, the ship of Theseus, has all its parts replaced over time, does it remain the same ship? To understand it better, imagine that Theseus sets sail on a majestic wooden ship. Over the years, due to wear and tear, the planks of the hull begin to rot and are replaced one by one. Later, the mast, the sails, the ropes, and every individual part are replaced with new materials. In the end, not a single original piece of the ship remains. The question is this ship still the ship of Theseus? The problem becomes even more complex if we imagine that the original removed pieces are carefully stored and then used to rebuild another ship identical to the original. Now we have two ships, one completely new, but with the same shape and functionality, and another made from the original pieces but restored. Which of these is the true ship of Theseus? This paradox touches on fundamental questions about identity and the persistence of objects over time. From a philosophical point of view, there are several interpretations. A theory of material identity holds that an object is identical over time only if it retains at least some of its original parts. According to this view, the original ship would cease to be the same once all its parts are replaced. Another theory, based on form or structure, argues that an object remains the same as long as it preserves the same form or functional structure, regardless of the materials that compose it. From this perspective, the renovated ship would be the same, since it maintains the same form and purpose. A third theory of spatiotemporal continuity suggests that an object is the same if it maintains physical continuity over time and space, even if its components change. According to this theory, the ship of Theseus would be the same if a gradual and continuous process of replacement has been maintained. This paradox has modern applications in areas such as biology, where the cells of our body are constantly replaced, and technology, as in the restoration of classic vehicles or the renovation of historic buildings. In the realm of personal identity, it raises questions about the continuity of the self. Are we the same person we were years ago? If all the cells of our body have changed, is our identity based on memory, consciousness, or the physical persistence of the body? The ship of Theseus has also been explored in literature and popular culture, such as in the television series WandaVision, where this paradox is directly presented while discussing the nature of identity and memory. Ultimately, the paradox of the ship of Theseus challenges us to reflect on what it really means to be the same over time, questioning the foundations of our understanding of identity, continuity, and change. Hilbert's infinite hotel paradox, formulated by the mathematician David Hilbert, is a thought experiment designed to illustrate the strange properties of infinity. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all occupied. Despite being full, it is still possible to accommodate new guests. Suppose a new guest arrives at the infinite hotel. Although all the rooms are occupied, the manager has a solution. He asks each guest to move to the next room. The occupant of room 1 moves to room 2, the one from room 2 to room 3, and so on. This frees up room 1, allowing the new guest to stay. This process can be repeated with a finite number of new guests. If 100 people arrive, each existing guest moves 100 rooms forward, freeing the first 100 rooms. However, the paradox becomes even more intriguing when an infinite number of new guests arrive. In this case, the manager can ask each current guest to move to the room with double their original number. The guest from room 1 moves to room 2, the one from room 2 to room 4, the one from room 3 to room 6, and so on. This frees all the odd-numbered rooms, making it possible to accommodate the infinite number of new guests. Hilbert's hotel also demonstrates how an infinite set can have the same cardinality as one of its proper subsets. For example, by moving all guests to even-numbered rooms, the odd-numbered rooms are freed. This implies that an infinite set of guests can be decomposed into two infinite subsets, both of the same size. Another interesting variation occurs when an infinite number of buses, each with an infinite number of passengers, arrives at the hotel. Using a strategy based on prime numbers and factors, it is possible to reassign everyone without leaving anyone out. This paradox not only challenges our intuition about infinity, but also has mathematical applications in set theory and cardinality. It illustrates how different types of infinities can coexist and how some infinities are larger than others. In philosophy, it raises questions about the nature of reality and what the existence of infinities means. It has also been used in literature and science fiction to explore abstract and paradoxical concepts. Hilbert's infinite hotel reminds us that infinity is a fascinating and complex idea, where the rules of ordinary logic seem to break down, opening a world of paradoxes and endless possibilities. The Pinocchio paradox is a modern variation of the classic liar paradox, presented in a simple way, but with deep philosophical and logical implications. Imagine Pinocchio, the famous character from the story by Carlo Collodi, whose nose grows every time he tells a lie. The paradox is triggered when Pinocchio says the sentence, "My nose is growing now." To understand the paradox, it is necessary to analyze it step by step. If Pinocchio's statement is true and his nose is growing, then he must be lying, since his nose only grows when he lies. But if he is lying, the statement, "My nose is growing now," is false, which means that it is not actually growing. However, if it is not growing, then the statement is true, which implies that it should be growing. This creates an infinite cycle of logical contradiction. This paradox is an example of self-reference, a phenomenon in which a statement refers to itself directly or indirectly. It shares similarities with the original liar paradox, in which a statement, such as "this sentence is false," generates a logical loop that is impossible to resolve in binary terms of truth and falsity. The problem of the Pinocchio paradox goes beyond simple contradiction and touches on deep questions about the nature of language, truth, and falsity. In classical logic, a proposition can only be true or false, but the Pinocchio paradox challenges this dichotomy by presenting a situation in which neither option is consistent. From a philosophical point of view, the paradox has been used to explore concepts such as semantics, self-reference, dialectical truth, and the limits of formal language. Philosophers such as Alfred Tarski and Kurt Gödel have addressed similar paradoxes while studying the theory of formal systems and the problems of completeness and incompleteness in mathematical logic. In the context of semantics, the Pinocchio paradox questions the very definition of truth. If the truth of a statement depends on a physical action, the growth of the nose, a problematic link is established between facts and statements, since a statement appears to cause an action that in turn determines the truth of the statement itself. This paradox also has applications in artificial intelligence and computing, especially in the programming of logical and decision-making systems. Algorithms that operate under strict true or false rules can encounter irresolvable dilemmas when faced with self-referential statements like Pinocchio's. One approach to addressing this paradox is to consider non-classical logic systems, such as paraconsistent logic or fuzzy logic, where a proposition can be both true and false to different degrees. In these systems, Pinocchio's statement could be interpreted more flexibly without generating an absolute contradiction. In popular culture, the Pinocchio paradox is a reminder that even children's stories can contain deep philosophical questions. The character of Pinocchio, created to teach the importance of honesty, becomes here a vehicle for exploring the complexities of language and logic. Ultimately, the Pinocchio paradox underscores the limitations of binary thinking and the need for more complex frameworks to address certain philosophical problems. Like other self-referential paradoxes, it reminds us that truth and falsity are not always as simple as they seem, and that, in some contexts, contradiction is inevitable and an essential part of human reasoning. Buridan's paradox is a philosophical dilemma that illustrates the problems of indecision and extreme rationality in decision-making. It is attributed to the medieval philosopher Jean Buridan, although he himself never formulated the paradox in exactly this way. The paradox is generally presented as follows. Imagine a donkey placed at exactly the same distance between two identical piles of hay. Both piles are equally attractive and accessible, with no difference that could make one more desirable than the other. The donkey, having no rational criterion to choose between the two piles, becomes trapped in a state of absolute indecision and eventually dies of hunger because it is unable to make a decision. This paradox is not only about a zoological problem, but is a philosophical illustration of the problem of free choice and rationality. Its origin is related to the idea that if all options are equally valid and there are no significant differences between them, a rational agent should be unable to choose. In this sense, the paradox questions the belief that rational agents always make decisions based on objective reasons. Buridan's donkey also raises important questions in logic and decision theory. In human decision-making, we rarely face perfectly balanced options, but the paradox shows the difficulty of deciding when there are no perceptible differences between alternatives. This has practical applications in fields such as economics, politics, and behavioral psychology. From a philosophical perspective, the paradox has been used to argue against absolute determinism. If a rational being is paralyzed by the absence of an objective reason to act, how can everyday human decisions be justified, where we often act without clear reasons or even impulsively? Several solutions have been proposed for Buridan's donkey paradox. One interpretation is that decision-making can include non-rational elements, such as intuition or chance. For example, an external factor, such as a slight wind that moves one of the piles of hay, could incline the donkey to choose. Another solution suggests that rational beings possess a decision mechanism that does not require perfect justification, but simply a voluntary action to break the paralysis. In probability theory, it has been suggested that even in situations of total uncertainty, an agent can make decisions by assigning random probabilities to the auctions. This implies that the choice, although it may appear arbitrary, can still be rational within a probabilistic framework. Another interesting perspective is the notion of micro-differences. This suggests that total paralysis is unlikely in real scenarios, since there is always some degree of asymmetry. In literature and popular culture, Buridan's donkey paradox has been explored to reflect human indecision and the consequences of analysis paralysis. Characters faced with impossible decisions or afraid of making the wrong choice are recurring examples of this paradox applied to narrative. Ultimately, Buridan's donkey paradox forces us to reflect on the nature of rationality and decision-making. It reminds us that logical perfection is not always possible or desirable, and that in many cases, action must precede absolute certainty. The donkey's paralysis is a symbol of the conflict between pure reason and the practical necessity to act, a valuable lesson both in philosophy and in everyday life. The paradox of self-reference is a fundamental concept in logic and the philosophy of language, in which a statement, set, or system refers to itself in a way that generates logical contradictions. This paradox challenges conventional notions of truth and consistency and has been widely studied in philosophical, mathematical, and literary contexts. One of the most famous examples of self-reference is the liar paradox, expressed by the statement, "This sentence is false. If the statement is true, then what it claims must be correct," meaning that it is false, which leads to a contradiction. If it is false, then what it claims is not correct, which would imply that it is true. This infinite cycle of contradiction shows how self-reference can create insurmountable problems within classical logical systems. Another important example is Russell's paradox, proposed by the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in the context of set theory. Russell formulated the question, does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? If it does, then it contradicts its own definition by being a set that does not contain itself. If it does not, then it should contain itself, since it is a set that does not contain itself. This paradox led to the collapse of Frege's naive set theory and motivated the development of more rigorous systems, such as type theory and the axioms of Zermelo and Fraenkel. In mathematics, self-reference is fundamental in Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Kurt Gödel demonstrated that any formal system sufficiently powerful to describe arithmetic contains true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. Gödel used a sophisticated form of self-reference to construct a statement that essentially says, "This statement is not provable." If it were provable, then the system would be inconsistent. If it is not provable, then it is true but unprovable, which demonstrates the incompleteness of the system. In philosophy, Self-reference raises questions about the nature of truth, meaning, and the coherence of language. For example, Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction holds that a proposition cannot be true and false at the same time. However, self-referential paradoxes challenge this idea by presenting statements that seem to violate this fundamental principle of classical logic. In literature, self-reference has been explored by writers such as Jorge Luis Borges and Douglas Hofstadter. In stories like The Library of Babel and The Garden of Forking Paths, Borges plays with the idea of infinitely self-referential structures and narratives that collapse in on themselves. Hofstadter, in his work Gödel, Escher, Bach, explores self-reference through art, music, and mathematics, showing how systems can reflect and contradict themselves. Even in computer programming and artificial intelligence, self-reference is a crucial concept. Programs that call themselves, known as recursive functions, are fundamental in modern computing. However, self-reference can also generate problems, such as in the case of the halting paradox, which demonstrates that it is not possible to construct an algorithm capable of determining whether any arbitrary program will finish executing or run indefinitely. In conclusion, the paradox of self-reference is not just an intellectual curiosity, but a profound challenge to our notions of truth, consistency, and formal understanding of language and logic. From the liar paradox to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, self-reference continues to be a central topic across multiple disciplines, reminding us of the inherent limits of rational thought and the structure of human knowledge. The time travel paradox is one of the most fascinating and complex concepts in philosophy and science fiction, challenging our understanding of causality, reality, and the structure of the universe. This paradox arises when a past, present, or future event appears to influence itself in a way that generates logical contradictions. A classic example is the grandfather paradox. Imagine that someone travels to the past and accidentally kills their own grandfather before he has children. If the grandfather dies, then the time traveler would never have been born, and therefore would not have been able to travel to the past to commit the act. However, if the traveler is never born, then the grandfather never died, and the traveler should exist, creating a logical cycle with no apparent resolution. This paradox raises the question of determinism and free will. If the past can be altered, is the future completely malleable? Or, on the contrary, does a predetermined destiny exist that ensures certain events always occur in the same way, regardless of the actions of a time traveler? There are several theories that attempt to address this paradox. One is the single timeline theory. This theory holds that only one timeline exists, and that any change made in the past will be immediately reflected in the future. However, this implies the logical paradox that certain actions can make time travel itself impossible, such as the grandfather scenario mentioned earlier. Another is the multiple universes theory. This theory proposes that every time someone travels to the past and makes a change, a new timeline or parallel universe is created in which the change has occurred. In this model, the time traveler does not affect their original timeline, but instead generates an alternative reality with different consequences. A third is the closed causal loop theory. In this interpretation, time travel is consistent with a single fixed destiny. Everything the traveler does in the past is already integrated into their own present and future. This implies that any action taken in the past has already happened and cannot be changed, thus closing the causal loop. A fourth is Novikov's self-consistency principle. This hypothesis, developed by the physicist Igor Novikov, argues that it is impossible to make changes to the past that generate paradoxes. Any action taken by a time traveler will be consistent with events that have already occurred. For example, if someone attempts to prevent an important historical event, they will inevitably fail, since that event is already fixed in the timeline. The time travel paradox is not only a speculative topic, but also has roots in theoretical physics and general relativity. Wormhole solutions and closed time-like curves in Einstein's theory theoretically allow time travel under certain extreme conditions of space and time. In popular culture, the time travel paradox has inspired countless works of fiction. Films such as Back to the Future, Looper, and Interstellar explore different aspects of this paradox, while series such as Dark take the idea to the extreme with complex plots involving time loops and multiple timelines. From a philosophical point of view, the time travel paradox challenges our notions of identity and causality. Is it truly possible to change the past, or are we trapped in an unalterable destiny? Does the existence of free will remain if the future is predetermined? Ultimately, the time travel paradox remains an unresolved mystery. Although science has not yet demonstrated the possibility of time travel, the theoretical exploration of these concepts continues to challenge our understanding of the universe, forcing us to rethink our most basic conceptions of time, reality, and causality itself. The infinite monkey paradox is a thought experiment that illustrates the properties of infinity and probability. It suggests that given an infinite number of monkeys typing randomly on typewriters for an infinite amount of time, they would eventually produce the complete works of William Shakespeare, such as Hamlet or Macbeth. This concept is based on probability theory and the nature of infinity. Although the probability of a monkey typing a coherent work by chance is extremely low, when an infinite number of monkeys and infinite time are introduced, any possible sequence of characters, no matter how improbable, will eventually be produced. The paradox is used to illustrate how, in an infinite context, events with an almost zero probability can become certainties. This challenges our intuition about randomness and order, suggesting that absolute chaos, with enough time and resources, can generate complex and meaningful structures. In mathematics, this paradox relates to the concept of Markov chains and stochastic processes, where random systems can, under certain conditions, produce specific outcomes. It is also connected to the law of large numbers, which states that as the number of trials increases, observed results converge toward expected outcomes. From a philosophical perspective, the infinite monkey paradox raises questions about the nature of creativity, chance, and inevitability. Is the creation of literary masterpieces simply a matter of correctly combining words? Or is there something deeper in the human mind that transcends mere randomness? Moreover, this paradox has been used to discuss topics related to entropy and disorder in the universe. The idea that total disorder can eventually generate complex order prompts reflections on the origin of life and the structure of the cosmos. In popular culture, the infinite monkey paradox has been referenced multiple times. For example, in the Simpsons series, there is a scene where Mr. Burns has a room full of monkeys typing on typewriters, attempting to produce classic literature. Although the paradox serves as a useful tool to explore mathematical and philosophical concepts, the idea of infinite monkeys typing is practically unfeasible. However, it serves as a powerful metaphor for understanding how, in an infinite framework, even the most improbable events are not only possible, but inevitable. In summary, the infinite monkey paradox invites us to reflect on the relationship between chance and creation, the nature of infinity, and how in an unlimited universe, the improbable becomes certain. The crocodile paradox is an ancient logical paradox that originates in Greek philosophy and raises deep questions about truth, lying, and self-reference. This paradox arises from a hypothetical situation where a crocodile steals a child and promises to return it only if the father correctly guesses what the crocodile will do next. Let's suppose the crocodile grabs a man's child and says that if the father guesses correctly whether or not he will return the child, the crocodile will return the child. Otherwise, he will keep the child. Here arises the dilemma. If the father responds that the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile decides to keep the child, the crocodile would have fulfilled his promise by acting according to the prediction. However, if the crocodile decides to return the child, he would be violating the condition, as the father predicted the opposite. On the other hand, if the father says the crocodile will return the child, the crocodile could decide not to return it, which would break his word, since the father predicted correctly. This logical contradiction exposes an infinite cycle of decisions without a clear resolution, where the rules of the promise and prediction self-destruct. This paradox is similar to the liar paradox and self-referential paradoxes, as both revolve around statements that contradict themselves. The crocodile statement is self-referential because the outcome of the situation depends on the truth or falsity of a statement about itself. Philosophically, the crocodile paradox questions the nature of truth and conditional logic. Can a system of rules be entirely coherent when it contains self-referential statements? This has led philosophers and logicians to explore the limits of formal systems and paradoxes of semantics. In mathematics and formal logic, paradoxes like the crocodile paradox have been studied in set theory and truth theory. Bertrand Russell, for example, addressed similar problems with his paradox of sets that do not contain themselves, which led to the development of type theory and more rigorous logical systems. From an ethical perspective, the crocodile paradox can also be interpreted as a moral dilemma. Is it right to make conditional promises that cannot be fulfilled without generating contradictions? At what point does a promise become a logical deceit? In literature and popular culture, the crocodile paradox has inspired stories and tales exploring the complexity of promises and truth. In some stories, the crocodile becomes a symbol of cunning and manipulation, using impossible promises to confuse and control its victims. Psychologically, this paradox also illustrates the internal conflicts that arise when faced with impossible decisions or situations where any choice seems to lead to a contradiction. These dilemmas are common in everyday life, where decisions are not always as simple as they appear. In conclusion, the crocodile paradox is much more than a simple logical game. It is a powerful reminder of the limitations of language and logic, a challenge to our intuitions about truth, and a fascinating example of how philosophy can reveal deep complexities in seemingly simple situations. Like other classic paradoxes, it continues to inspire debate and reflection across multiple disciplines, from formal logic to ethics and narrative. The arrow paradox, formulated by Zeno of Elea, is one of the most famous paradoxes in ancient philosophy and addresses the nature of motion and time. This paradox centers on a deep and seemingly contradictory argument about what continuous motion means. Zeno argued that an arrow in flight at any given moment occupies a specific position in space. If, at a certain moment, the arrow is at a defined point and is not moving relative to that point, then at that instant, it is stationary. Since time consists of an infinite succession of moments, and in each of them the arrow is stationary, Zeno concludes that motion is impossible. This paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of motion by breaking down time into infinitesimally small instants. It seems that motion is an illusion because at each point in time, the arrow does not appear to move. Zeno's argument can be better understood through the modern concept of continuity and limits in calculus. In differential and integral calculus, motion is described as the sum of infinite infinitesimal increments, which allows an object to change position continuously over time, even if each individual instant seems static. From a philosophical standpoint, the arrow paradox questions the nature of time and the reality of change. Is time made up of indivisible moments, or is it a fluid continuity? This question remains debated in contemporary philosophy and theoretical physics. In the context of modern physics, theories such as quantum mechanics and relativity have explored ideas about the granularity of space and time. Some physicists theorize that time may be quantized at a fundamental level, which could give a new perspective on Zeno's paradox. Beyond philosophy and physics, the arrow paradox has also been used in literature and art as a metaphor for stagnation and the perception of time. Authors such as Jorge Luis Borges have explored these ideas in their works, using the paradox to reflect on the subjective perception of time. In conclusion, Zeno's arrow paradox is much more than a simple logical game. It forces us to question our fundamental assumptions about the nature of time, motion, and reality itself. While modern calculus provides a mathematical solution to the dilemma, the philosophical questions it raises remain relevant and fascinating to this day. Plato's cave paradox, also known as the allegory of the cave, is one of the deepest and most complex allegories in the history of philosophy. It appears in the seventh book of the Republic, written by Plato, and uses a visual metaphor to explore the nature of knowledge, perception, and reality. Plato describes a cave in which a group of prisoners has been chained since birth. These prisoners are forced to look only at a wall in front of them, unable to turn their heads or see what lies behind them. Behind the prisoners, at some distance, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a wall, along which figures of people and objects pass, casting shadows onto the wall facing the prisoners. These prisoners, having never known any other reality, take the shadows projected on the wall to be the true reality. For them, the shadows are everything that exists, since they have never seen the source of light or the real objects that produce those shadows. Their perception of the world is limited to mere two-dimensional projections, distorted and reduced. Plato uses this image to illustrate how human sensory experience is limited and distorted by our immediate perceptions. One day, one of the prisoners manages to free himself, and upon turning around, sees for the first time the fire and the real objects that cast the shadows. At first, the light of the fire is blinding and confusing, since he is accustomed to the dimness of the shadows. However, little by little, he begins to understand that the shadows were only a limited representation of a more complex reality. Driven by curiosity and the desire to understand more, the prisoner eventually leaves the cave. Upon leaving the darkness, he encounters the light of the sun, a light far brighter and more powerful than the fire inside the cave. At first, the sunlight is even more blinding, but over time, he begins to distinguish the true shapes of objects, colors, and nature, and finally understands the truth of the reality outside the cave. The sun in the allegory represents the idea of the good and ultimate truth in Platonic philosophy. It is the source of all knowledge and understanding. The freed prisoner now realizes how limited and false his perception inside the cave was. However, when he returns to the cave to tell the other prisoners about the outside reality, they are skeptical and even hostile. Accustomed to the shadows and having never experienced the sunlight, they cannot understand or accept the free prisoner's experience. For them, the shadows remain the only reality. This allegory illustrates the difficulty of changing deeply rooted beliefs and how the process of acquiring true knowledge can be challenging and painful. Plato uses the cave to symbolize human ignorance and resistance to change. The prisoners represent people trapped in sensory perception and opinion, while the freed prisoner represents the philosopher who seeks truth beyond appearances. Philosophically, Plato's cave raises fundamental questions about reality, perception, and knowledge. Do we live in an objective reality, or do we only perceive a distorted version of it? To what extent are our beliefs shaped by our limited perception? This allegory has profoundly influenced Western philosophy, serving as a foundation for theories of idealism, empiricism, and epistemology. It also connects with modern themes such as virtual reality, media manipulation, and the construction of reality in contemporary societies. The myth of the cave reminds us of the importance of critical questioning and the pursuit of knowledge beyond appearances. Like the freed prisoner, each individual has the capacity to seek truth and challenge the shadows that limit their understanding of the world. However, this process requires courage, effort, and often resistance from those who have not yet seen the light beyond the cave. The bootstrap paradox, also known as the ontological paradox, is a fascinating paradox that challenges our understanding of time, causality, and existence itself. It arises in the context of time travel and raises profound questions about the origin of information and objects. This paradox has been widely explored in both philosophy and science fiction. To understand it, imagine the following scenario. A man named John finds a physics book in his mailbox one day. Fascinated, he studies the book for years and becomes a renowned physicist. Eventually, using the knowledge acquired from the book, John invents a time machine. To ensure that his knowledge is not lost, he travels to the past and places the same book in his own mailbox years earlier, thus initiating the cycle that led him to become a physicist. The problem posed by this paradox is fundamental. Who originally wrote that book? The book appears to have no defined origin, since its existence is a closed loop of cause and effect. The information contained in it seems to arise from nothing, which contradicts the conventional idea that every effect must have a prior cause. This dilemma is not merely a mental game. It has deep implications for the philosophy of time and causality. In a linear view of time, events must have a clear sequence of cause and effect. However, the bootstrap paradox challenges this idea by presenting a causal loop with no clear starting point. In theoretical physics, this paradox is discussed mainly in the context of time travel. Mathematical solutions to Einstein's general relativity equations allow for the existence of closed time-like curves, which could theoretically permit travel into the past. In such scenarios, an object or piece of information could be its own cause, as occurs in the bootstrap paradox. A famous example in popular culture is the film Predestination from the year 2014, based on the short story All You Zombies by Robert A. Heinlein. In this story, a character travels to the past and becomes his own father and mother, creating a completely closed cycle in which biological origin is erased. Another example is Thor's hammer in the film Avengers Endgame, where the hammer is taken from the past and used in the present, but then returned to the past, creating a loop with no clear origin for the object. From a logical perspective, the bootstrap paradox also raises questions about identity and authenticity. Can an object or piece of information be authentic if it never had a defined origin? If a scientific discovery or a work of art is transmitted through time in this way, is it genuine or merely a copy with no original author? The paradox also has philosophical applications, as it challenges notions of creation and authorship, suggesting that certain concepts could exist without a clear origin. This leads to questions about the very nature of reality and time. As for proposed solutions, some theorists suggest that the paradox could be resolved through multiverse theory, where multiple timelines exist simultaneously, and an object may originate from a parallel universe. Others argue that the paradox simply indicates limits in our current understanding of time and causality. Ultimately, the bootstrap paradox remains a conceptual challenge in both science and philosophy. It forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the flow of time and the relationship between cause and effect. Beyond science fiction, it raises fundamental questions about the origin of knowledge and the nature of reality itself, making it one of the most fascinating and complex paradoxes in our understanding of the universe. The ferryman paradox, also known as the wolf, goat, and cabbage paradox, is an ancient logical puzzle that explores constraints and limitations in decision-making. This paradox has ancient origins and has been used for centuries to illustrate fundamental principles of problem-solving and strategic planning. The problem is posed as follows. A ferryman needs to cross a river with three items: a wolf, a goat, and a cabbage. The boat is small and can only carry the ferryman and one of the three items to the other side of the river at a time. However, there are restrictions. The wolf cannot be left alone with the goat because it would eat it, and the goat cannot be left alone with the cabbage because it would eat it. How can the ferryman cross the river safely, transporting all the items without any accident occurring? To solve this puzzle, it is necessary to think in a specific sequence of actions. One possible set of steps is the following. The ferryman first takes the goat to the other side of the river and leaves it there. Then he returns alone to the original side. Next, he takes the wolf to the other side of the river, but returns with the goat to the original side. After that, he takes the cabbage to the other side of the river and leaves it with the wolf. Finally, he returns to the original side and takes the goat across again. In this way, all the items cross safely and no rule is violated. This paradox illustrates several key concepts in logic and game theory. 1. Constraints and conditions. The problem shows how limitations in a system, such as the boat's capacity and safety rules, affect the available options and the required planning. 2. Sequential thinking. Solving it requires breaking the problem down into a series of logical steps, where each step influences the next, forcing consideration of future consequences. 3. Complex problem solving. The ferryman must think strategically and consider non-linear solutions, such as the need to return to the starting point with the goat. 4. Symbolic representation. Although the paradox uses a narrative scenario, it is actually an abstraction of more general problems in mathematics and computer science, such as resource management and task scheduling. This paradox also has philosophical implications. It symbolizes moral dilemmas and decision-making under constraints. How do we prioritize options when all of them involve potential risks? This type of thinking applies to fields such as ethics, business decision-making, and crisis management. In education, the ferryman paradox is used to teach problem-solving skills and critical thinking. Students learn the importance of analyzing constraints and planning ahead, skills that are essential both in mathematics and in everyday life. In conclusion, the ferryman paradox is much more than a simple logical puzzle. It is a powerful tool for illustrating fundamental concepts in logic, planning, and decision-making. Throughout history, it has been used not only as entertainment, but also as a metaphor for the complex challenges of life and thought.